Howdy and good afternoon. My name is Mike Mearswa. I'm the State Floodplain Manager for the state of California. I've been working with the California Department of Water Resources for over 22 years, where I actually started as an estuary modeler and hydrodynamic expert. Hopefully you had the opportunity to listen to session B3 on modeling coastal flood hazards earlier today, as our session actually builds on the work that was discussed in that session. I am personally excited about our three talks this afternoon. Coastal flood risk is perhaps one of the fastest rising areas of concern in the world. And I use that word rising out there because that's how we talk about things in the flood world. In California, over 60% of the population, which is over 24 million people, live or work in floodplains. And we have knowledge knowing that our flood exposure is continuing to grow in the state of California. And with that in mind, we initiated our own coastal flood risk reduction program, where hopefully this summer we'll be releasing $28 million to local efforts to mitigate flood risk. And this is in addition to $16 million in 2019 that the state legislature earmarked for some projects. With that in mind, our three speakers are going to share their experiences regarding the unique uncertainties in defining coastal flood hazards, in basically gaining the political willness to go through and take action, largely to fund these large-scale flood defense systems, and finally providing transparency in how we assess and communicate flood risk in the hopes that we can sustain federal and state efforts to buy down our risk in our coastal flood hazard areas. I will introduce each speaker and encourage you to enter your questions into the chat off to the side during each speaker's pre-recorded presentation. There'll be a bit of time following each of the presentations for you to go through and see the speakers actually answer some of the questions that you've entered into the chat that I'll read off. With that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, is Renee Collini with the Mississippi State University. She is a coastal climate resilience specialist with the Mississippi State University and the Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant Consortium, where she facilitates the flow of information between researchers and decision makers. She will be starting and giving a presentation on sea level rise, turning uncertainty into action.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me for my presentation. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about sea level rise, specifically how to turn uncertainty around sea level rise into action. To give you a sense of where we're headed, first I'm going to go over some of the basics around sea level rise just to make sure we're all on the same page. Then I'll talk about how to narrow down sea level rise scenarios. Then once you've done that, how you turn it into something meaningful. I'll give a few examples of other entities who've done this, and then with that, we'll wrap up our talk. The first thing to keep in mind when we're talking about sea level rise is that even small changes can have a big effect. And so suddenly the tides and the waves are interacting with the shoreline in new places and in new ways, reshaping the shoreline, kind of like how your nieces and nephews, since you don't see them very often, you notice right away when they're growing, but your own kids, since they're right in front of you every day, you might not notice some of those changes. And these changes can lead to pretty intense vulnerabilities. Specifically, when we say sea level rise, what does that look like? We're talking about exacerbating existing hazards we already experience on the coast. So reduced storm drainage, and this isn't directly on the coast, this is even inland, but without that rainwater being able to drain away, we see rainfall becoming a problem. There's exacerbated storm surge. This is from Cristobal in coastal Mississippi. It wasn't that big of a storm, yet there was a lot of water that got put on the coast. Increased erosion rates, high tide flooding, and saltwater intrusion. And this can both be into things like drinking water, but also getting into your infrastructure and wearing out timelines and speeding up maintenance schedules and things like that. All this adds up to impacts for people. This could mean health risks, water getting in places it shouldn't, sometimes it'll stagnate, and other examples. There's also safety issues. Then there's those direct damages, both to individuals such as our homes or their vehicles, but also to the infrastructure and the things we've invested in as a community together. Roads, wastewater infrastructure, that kind of stuff. There's also economic disruptions, and this serves, people can't actually get to the businesses, so they're disrupted, or the businesses themselves are flooded, costing them money. This leads to a reduction in services, and sometimes this reduction in services means if you're not generating that local revenue, then you can't contribute to, say, K-12 funding, like you have in this example here. But there's also, say, emergency personnel can't get to you, an ambulance can't get to your home if there's high tide flooding that's impacting it. And then there's also the fact that we can't use things that we're supposed to expect, such as roads. This is a road on Dauphin Island, high tide flooding. And, this guy just wanted to go to the grocery store and to one of the souvenir shops, and he couldn't do either on the island. So not only was he not able to use this service of the road, but again, that comes back to those economic disruptions. And then there's the cultural impacts. We are well known in our coastal areas, shipbuilding, seafood. It's an experience, it's a place, it has a sense of feeling. But you can only sustain impacts and damages that look like this so many times before that starts to get eaten away. And to sort of put a point on this, there's a paper that came out in 2013, Martinic et al., where they looked at social vulnerability and exposure to sea level rise and potential responses to that. So you see here broken down by coast. I'm going to walk you through it. In this area here, you've got the Pacific, North Atlantic, Gulf, and South Atlantic. Each color there just represents the area covered. It doesn't mean green good, red bad. If you zoom in here, you can see that it's based on vulnerability across the x-axis. So these are low vulnerability, these are high vulnerability, and then the numbers here are people at risk to sea level rise. So the first thing you might notice is there's a lot of people here. But then if you pull up this legend, it tells us what the different colors mean. And in the Gulf, our most socially vulnerable populations are very likely to have to abandon their homes. They don't have the resources or integrated into communities that can nourish or armor their shorelines. We go back to the big picture here. We see that not only do we have a lot of people at risk compared to some of the other parts of the country, but there's a lot more of that light blue here. And so in the Northern Gulf in particular, that cultural impact is definitely something that's being discussed. But the good news is sea level rise is not some surprising acute event. It's chronic, it's happening. We know it's happening. We know what's going to happen in the future. We can change this outcome. We can preserve our services, our infrastructure, our health, our communities, those cultures, but it will have to look different. We're going to have to live with existing water differently. We can't just hold the line and stay where we are and keep doing what we've been doing. So the first step in doing that is really understanding sea level rise. So first, let's just go back to basics. When we say what is sea level, what are we even talking about? What's rising? And so you can think of sea level as sort of the starting point of water depth, right? There's this much water, and then around that happens tides and waves and El Niños and storm surge to give you impacts. And so that overall starting point that the waves and the surge start from is getting higher. And we know this because there's been tide stations, some in more than 100 years in those locations. But we also have satellites more recently that are tracking even larger geographies. So we have this pinpointed information, broader information. We have a lot to tell us that seas are going up. And the primary two reasons for this are melting land ice, those glaciers and other things, along with thermal expansion of seawater. Think back to high school chemistry. Molecules that are warmer move more, and so they take up more space. But also we have local impacts. And so there are things that can happen such as compaction, pulling out water and gas, taking out, oil and things like that. And it causes the ground itself to compact and go down, to subside. Additionally, whenever we had glaciers that extended all the way out across the North America shelf, we know that glacier was heavy. And so in some places it was pushing down. And in other places, kind of like when you sit on the edge of a mattress, how the edges bulge up, those bulges are actually in the process of going back down. So we've got some spring up as the glaciers retreated and some of those bulges going down. So like along the Gulf Coast, we see some of that also, say like in New York. We know that is why we see some high rates of the vertical land motion in the downward direction. And so if you put this all together, you get relative sea level rise, also known as like local sea level rise, what sea level rise looks like in a specific location along the coast. So it's that melting land ice and thermal expansion bringing water up, but also the land itself moving, whether it's from groundwater extraction or the fact that you're on one of those bulges on the land that's now going down in response to the glaciers being gone. And it's important that we track relative sea level rise and we plan for relative sea level rise. Here is a map of trends of sea level rise we've already seen around the United States. And you can see some of those are going down, some of them are going up. The overall globally water is rising, but then some of that rebound we were talking about after the glacier has retreated is actually leading for the land to uplift faster than the water's rising. But then you see areas like in the northern Gulf, you've got those big scary reds, lots of compaction. So it's lots of differences and really important to know what you're talking about when you're thinking locally. And so, for example, if you take a look at, say, Dauphin Island, Alabama, they've had a little over 8 inches of sea level rise since 1966. An important thing to know about that, though, is that a great deal of that has occurred in the last 25 years. We're seeing acceleration really clearly there. So not only is it important to track relative sea level rise, but to also understand that that rate of rise is accelerating. So what does that look like when we say we got a plan for relative sea level rise? Well, what you see here on the screen are projections specifically for Jackson County. Those are relative sea level rise projections. These X's that just popped up over here on the right-hand side, these show you where each of the corresponding color curves would have intersected with the year 2100 if we used the global scenarios. So for example, the high sea level rise scenario for the global average is just over 8 feet, but in Jackson County, Mississippi, it's over 11 feet. And that carries on all the way down. You even look at these low and intermediate low scenarios, they're over 2 feet. They're substantially lower for the global averages. So it's really important to find those projections for your area. Luckily, we have that. So there was a report that came out in 2017. Sweet et al., that was the lead author, but also it's known as the NOAA Technical Report for NOAA Technical Report 83. This was in service for the National Climate Assessment 4, and it provides those global and regional sea level rise scenarios. You can find projections for individual tide gauges or at a 1 degree by 1 degree latitude longitude gridded cell for the entire United States. So we generated a printable PDF resource. There's a suite of resources there that you can go through to pull the data easily and drop them into a template. So you have a 2-pager, and in that 2-pager, you have the curves for your specific location. We call out specific time steps, such as 1.7 feet of sea level rise by 2060, if you're looking at an intermediate scenario. There's also information on the back around the probabilities that each of these curves will occur based on different carbon emission scenarios. I'm going to talk more about this specifically, but just know in this 2-pager, that's some of the information that's there. Additionally, we have an online web resource, so you can make an HTML page that generates that same information. And so if you look here, you get a map, you click on that one, and it's kind of hard to see, but it says there, generate 2-pager, and then you just fill in some blanks, and then you get that same kind of information on an HTML page. You can find all of that at localslr.org. So once you've got your relative sea level rise scenarios, now you need to move forward into the next step, which is actually translating those scenarios into planning information. And the very first step is to narrow them down, right? People wonder, why is there such a large range? And they tend to have a sense that it's just because scientists don't know what they're doing. But the reality is there's 3 really good reasons why we have scenarios and not just one number. The first is we don't know how much carbon is going to be in the atmosphere. So you see here, I'm going to talk you through this graph. You've got the year across the x-axis, and you've got carbon concentration here, and then temperature over here on the other one. And the thing to keep in mind is that this solid red and then yellow line, that's carbon in the atmosphere, CO2 in the atmosphere. And then the blue wiggly line is temperature. And so you see here that they're tracking together, but the problem is we can't predict or project exactly how much carbon is going to be in the atmosphere because this is dependent on people and their choices. And we're in the middle of making a lot of critical choices right now. So over time, that uncertainty will narrow, but right now there's a lot of uncertainty around what will happen. Additionally, there's natural variability. The environment, nature, none of it is static. And then you think about all the things that aren't static wiggling together, that creates a range of potential things that could happen. And so again, if I just go back to the same graph, point out the blue line is in fact wiggly. It's going up, that's the trend, it's higher, but it's got lots of wiggle in that trend. And so we have to account for that natural variability. And the last reason is we're still studying the ice sheet melt. This is the science to watch. It's continuing to get better. We just had a lot of papers come out in late 2019 and 2020 that talk about some advancements here. But as scenarios are continually updated using this science, that's an area where we're really improving. So instead of looking at this range of the global scenarios and feeling like it's just a giant mess, you can really reframe this as thinking of what's scientifically possible. These scenarios represent the range of what could happen. However, as I said earlier, there are probabilities associated with these. They're not equally as likely. And so depending on the carbon scenario you're looking at, right? So we talked about how the carbon emission scenarios makes a big difference. You get an understanding of, okay, if we have no change in carbon emissions, we start to get a sense of how much sea level rise we might see, versus if there's a dramatic cut in carbon emissions, then there's a difference in what we might see. So going over here to this column on the right, we see that this is no change in carbon emissions. That's the scenario. And then we have the different sea level rise scenarios coming down here. So for example, the low and intermediate low scenario are highly likely to happen. Even if we move into, say, RCP 2.6, we're still really likely to see that low sea level rise scenario, less so with the intermediate. But as you move down, no matter in which column, we see that the higher scenarios, extreme and high, they become a lot less likely. So from that, we can understand it's possible to have that extreme sea level rise scenario, but it doesn't mean that it's very likely to happen. We can then use this information to start to think about our own risk tolerance to know what amount of sea level rise it might be best to plan for. So when we talk about risk tolerance, you can think about a high tolerance for risk, meaning that if it did get flooded or was impacted by sea level rise, that would be a pretty minor impact. If you have a low tolerance for risk, you are not about risk in your life or in your project, then that means that it would have a major impact if it was impacted by sea level rise. Ways to strategically think about your risk tolerance, make sure that you're being somewhat objective, is you can think about the scale. Things that are much larger tend to have a lower risk tolerance. The location, and this isn't just about proximity to coast, but it's also about the people, right? The way that people in the bayous of Louisiana feel about living with water and the risk they're willing to accept is very different than, say, someone living in a suburb of the city of Mobile. So considering that cultural and the location history and risk tolerance is part of that. There's also cost or value. It's not just about dollars here. Again, is it culturally important? Is it significant somehow? But generally speaking, the more expensive something is, the lower your risk tolerance. Also, its function. Is this serving a critical function for your community? Is this a hospital? Is this a wastewater facility? Is this drinking water? And how many people are going to be impacted if it doesn't work? Is this the only hospital in the entire county? Is this a really rare or critical service that serves a large number of your population? Again, that makes the risk tolerance go down. Length of time. If you want it to last a while, it's going to have to not flood frequently. Generally speaking, again, that is the rule of thumb. And then adaptability. There are some things that you can put in place or adapt over time. There are some things that are fixed and static, and once they're there or they're highly integrated with other systems, it makes it much harder to adapt or move them later. So all of these things would contribute to where you might fall on the spectrum of risk tolerance. To give you some examples here, kind of put it all together, if you have a low tolerance for risk, say you're building a hospital in a coastal county, it serves a lot of people, it's a really critical function, it's replacing one that's out of business or that failed, you want to make sure that that thing does not flood. So you're going to be thinking about these high sea level rise scenarios. They have a low chance of happening, but if it did, it would have a really big impact and you don't want it to be negatively affected. Now, if you're, say, at a moderate tolerance for risk, I'm just going to give you a personal example. When I bought my house a few years ago, I definitely fell in this category. I was not comfortable just planning for the low and intermediate low. I didn't want to just be for sure, but I also wasn't going to plan all the way for the worst case scenario because while a house is expensive to me, it's not critical for the entire community. It doesn't cost millions of dollars. So I was planning in that intermediate high range. And then last, if you have a high tolerance for risk, say you're building a shed, or a boathouse, you're really only going to plan for these things that have a high chance of happening. But if they did, it would have a low impact if these probabilities were exceeded. So just to put it all together, say you're looking at a hospital in a coastal county. It's 2020 now. You'd like it to last, say, 50 years. And you have a low tolerance for risk, so you're going to look at these high sea level rise scenarios. Now, instead of having this giant planning range, you're looking at planning for around 4 feet of sea level rise in the next 50 years. That's a much more concrete and manageable number, which is great. but you still have to translate that information into planning somehow. So the way you translate that scenario, because really what does 4 feet mean, is you could, for example, go look and say what is the new high tide going to look like? This is an example of the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer. It's a great screening level tool. You come over here, you pull that button up to 4 feet, and you can see what high tide might look like under 4 feet of sea level rise for your area. With this information, then you can start to identify low-lying areas that are at risk. You can see where high tide flooding is going to be happening more often. Then you can start to think what that might mean for, say, your infrastructure. Are stormwater outfalls there? Are there lift stations that might be compromised? And then you can also think about transportation, right? Are there any important commerce thoroughfares? Are there emergency management routes? What does maintenance look like? Are some of these roads less durable to regular saltwater flooding? All of these are planning steps you could take in response to a changing floodplain. Additionally, you could look at future storm surge. For those of you who this is available to, so there's a version of this for the entire North Atlantic coast. The South Atlantic coast is about to have that. And then this is actually a product from the Northern Gulf of Mexico. It's a research project. There's a similar one in South Florida called ACUNE. This one is from the Coastal Dynamics of Sea Level Rise, the Easler project. But it tells you how storm surge might change with sea level rise. Again, you've got to put context on things, right? Like how much are we actually talking about changing? How do those hazards change? And so if you look at how sea level rise might change, I'm going to go back and forth a little bit. You can see here that it got more bright, it's bigger, so the water is deeper, it's going farther inland. And from that information, you're able to understand, say, how the 1% or 0.2% annual chance floodplain might be deeper, might go farther inland. Those changes in inundation depth you could use for considering freeboard or other kinds of policy initiatives. You could consider at-risk infrastructure. Bridges are a big thing. Are we talking about them being able to withstand future surge? What does design look like when you have opportunities for infrastructure upgrades or maintenance? And then another critical one are your evacuation routes and return routes. Are any of those critical ones vulnerable to future flooding or to future damage? Those are just a couple tools that could help. I'm going to point you to this resource called Gulf Tree because it has a lot of the tools for the Northern Gulf, or for the entire Gulf of Mexico around climate resilience. And you answer a few questions like this, I need help with, and then you can say you're identifying vulnerabilities or you're doing adaptation planning. And then it narrows down the 100 and something tools in there to just a couple that best meet your needs. So like I said, the Sea Level Rise Viewer and the Easler project, those are just 2 tools out of hundreds to help answer your questions around climate change and future flooding to help find understanding future conditions. So now I want to talk briefly about some case studies where sea level rise information was integrated into the planning process using these kinds of fundamental skills. The first is the Jackson County Utility Authority. They are working right now on the design and construction of a new wastewater reclamation facility. And they integrated sea level rise during 2 phases of this project. The first was in their site selection. Obviously, a lot goes into site selection for a wastewater treatment facility. We're talking about cost, availability, proximity to service area, enough land. I mean, just all kinds of really critical things. Once those critical aspects were used to narrow down several plots of land, those available lots were looked at for other considerations, including sea level rise, and they looked at which of those lots would be impacted by high tide in the future, and the one that was available to them that was not impacted by high tide in the future, and by impacted I mean high tide was coming up on that land, that was the one they selected. Another is right now they're considering some sort of flood protection, potentially a berm, and so we worked with them to look at the 0.2% annual chance event over a 50-year lifespan. And by doing so, we did a cost-benefit analysis, and this sort of happened within that first 15% design, just after it was done, to make sure that there was plenty of time to understand and integrate this into it. I'm not going to get into a lot more depth about this. You can go see Camille, my colleague, talk about this. She's in session E6 on Wednesday at 1:30, so tomorrow. And she'll get into the details of that cost-benefit analysis. But the thing to note here is just there were 2 different ways they could integrate this, and they actually used that high risk scenario or low risk tolerance. They went with 6 feet of sea level rise by 2080 because that was the high curve. And that was their choice. They used that kind of information when they looked at high tide. They used that information when they were looking at that 0.2% annual chance event to understand how surge might change, how high tide might change, what that might mean for this facility. And again, if you want to know more about the cost-benefit analysis of designing the berm for sea level rise, Camille will be talking about that tomorrow at 1:30. So I want to talk about Dauphin Island now as a case study, which is sort of a contrast to JCUA, the Jackson County Utility Authority, because they had a very critical service. It served a lot of people. It's very expensive, and it was very integrated into an existing system. It's hard to adapt. Dauphin Island has more adaptive capacity. They have a lot of ongoing resilience efforts, but one of the gaps was looking at how to protect their infrastructure that was in more vulnerable areas. So we're working with our colleague, Dr. Stephanie Small, to develop an adaptation pathway. And so conceptually, what this looks like is you look at strategies to protect your infrastructure from least costly to most costly, and then you look at their effectiveness under different amounts of sea level rise. And from that, you can construct a pathway navigating, okay, what's the least we can do right now that's still effective, but these strategies also build on each other. So as you see sea levels go up and you have those observed rates, you're able to adapt and implement these things based on what you're seeing instead of necessarily committing out to a scenario that may or may not happen a long time in the future. And for these small communities with not as much resources, this is really a great option. So to wrap up, because 25 minutes is a really long time, I just wanted to sort of remind you of some key things we heard today. Sea level rise is already impacting our communities in a negative way. With the information that we have been gaining around future conditions and local rates of sea level rise and projections, we're able to start adapting and mitigating now. We have those resources not only to understand, but also to integrate this into planning, use community values and other types of social science to integrate this into how we design things, how we look at our community. And adaptation is diverse. These resources are sort of foundational tools that can be applied in a variety of ways, everything from that wastewater treatment facility to the adaptations on Dauphin Island and everything in between. And we have enough information to act now. It's important that we do something now when we have the information. We don't want to wait too long because it may be too late by then. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. I'm with, I didn't even mention this, PLACE, the Program for Local Adaptation to Climate Effects Sea Level Rise, which is a partnership between Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant, Florida Sea Grant, and Mississippi State University Extension working on this topic. If you have any questions, reach out to me. Thank you so much for your time.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. I hope you were as excited as I was about Renee's presentation. I'm just going to editorialize right here. Hearing that there is basically this data set covering the entire United States coast is fantastic. And I think Renee also correctly identified that now we have this range of information, which means the decision-making is just started as to which number we pick when we get into our mitigation. With that in mind, I had a clarification question that already came in, Renee. And that is on the case, one of the case studies that you had out there. Our audience is curious. Did the community, when they saw the sea level rise information, they decide to include the structure or not?
So it was the opposite. There was one of the narrowed down options where they could build that was not impacted by future high tide. And it was not in the current floodplain. It will be in the future 0.2% and the 1% chance floodplain. But no, they went for the one option they had that was not in the current floodplain.
That sounds like it was pretty useful then for awareness. That's a success story for sure. The next question I have, and I apologize for going quick, is it came in early in your presentation, which is what will become of structures that have already been elevated or mitigated if the sea level actually reaches a higher base flood elevation than the range they chose to pick using this methodology and tool?
So I guess, I can't write policy for FEMA when it comes to flood insurance and things like that. Obviously, the physical risk will be there, and there will be damages and impacts from that. But we have seen, for example, out of Orange Beach, Alabama, where they had a 3-foot freeboard in some places. And then with the new maps, the base flood elevation did go up. And because of their smart forward thinking, many of their residents were still in compliance with the legislative or with the regulations. And so their insurance did not massively go up or is not on its way to massively go up. So yeah, that's what happens, right? Your insurance goes up if you aren't accommodating for sea level rise eventually.
No one wants to hear it, but that's often the reality we're faced with.
And of course, the damages that actually happen.
True. So I'm going to ask a question here because I haven't seen the others and we have just a couple seconds and it's kind of a long one. But given that there's this range of sea level rise estimates, have you thought about the role that the federal government and state governments have in providing guidance to local jurisdictions, how they might consider land use or building design, or how they will get into what leads into our next talk is the defense system designs?
Absolutely. And actually, this method for looking at regional sea level rise rates instead of national came out of DOD. And then it was expanded upon by NOAA. And so that was great. And then NOAA had some recommendations in that report specifically on how to deal with it. And then states like New Hampshire have already run with it, have great recommendations. And then we've been using that method that I described, as have New Hampshire and the state of Washington and others, in collaboration with federal organizations on how to make sense of this stuff.
Great. Thanks, Renee. Unfortunately, we've run out of time here. We might have some time at the end of all our presentations to revisit and bring some more questions back from Renee, so keep thinking about those. I want to introduce our next speaker is D.J.Rasmussen. DJ is a client scientist, engineer, and policy scholar, currently associated with Princeton University. And he is a co-author of Economic Risks of Climate Change in American Perspectives. Also has worked on informed multiple intergovernmental panel on climate change assessment reports, as well as been published in Science magazine. DJ is going to be presenting and sharing with us today really the political complexity of coastal flood risk reduction projects. Like, what does it take to really go through and get a flood defense system really initiated, implemented? DJ, the floor is yours.
Hi, my name is D.J.Rasmussen. I'm a researcher at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. This section of the ASFPM meeting is all about understanding and mitigating coastal flood risks. One of the first things that's likely to come to mind when thinking about mitigating coastal flood risk are the technical engineering solutions themselves, as well as the economic analyses that are used to justify their implementation. However, experience has shown that having a technically feasible and economically justifiable plan is simply not enough to move the plans forward from the drawing board to the point where they're able to break ground. Politics and social conflict inevitably result from interactions between diverse groups, organizations, communities, all with differing values, beliefs, interests, and influence. This political complexity comes into play when first deciding to do something about a coastal flood problem, deliberating over potential design options, and finally implementing the chosen flood risk reduction project. While there are many flood risk reduction strategies, in this presentation, I'll be specifically focusing on large coastal flood protection megaprojects. Coastal flood protection megaprojects, such as storm surge barriers and levees, provide an especially fruitful example for exploring how these political factors play a role in the planning and implementation of coastal flood risk reduction strategies. You're looking here at the Eastern Scheldt storm surge barrier, an example of a coastal flood defense megastructure. This particular structure is in the Netherlands. The barrier has several closable gates that allow for the tidal flow in and out of the Eastern Scheldt estuary. When a storm approaches, the gates close. While the Eastern Scheldt storm surge barrier broke ground in the 1970s, without sea level rise being a significant factor in its design, dozens of similar billion-dollar structures are currently being planned across the U.S. to protect portions of major metropolitan areas from coastal flooding and sea level rise. The goal of this presentation is to highlight how political complexity plays an important role in, first, the decision to pursue coastal flood risk reduction itself, then the decision of what to build exactly, and finally, the process of implementing the project itself. Before I continue, I'd like to acknowledge some collaborators, as well as the archives located on the East Coast of the US that provided access for some of the research I'll be showing in this presentation. I'd also like to acknowledge funding sources from Princeton University. So governments that are up to the task of managing floods have several options that I like to put in two specific categories. The first of which is to simply reduce the consequence of a flood. So allow it to happen, but then reduce the consequence. These are things like flood insurance, land use regulation, building codes, and improved warning and forecast systems. The second category I'd like to place government options into are reducing the flood hazard itself. These are things like coastal lands, like building out into the water and raising the land upwards, restoring wetlands, and finally, focusing on coastal flood protection, which we'll be focusing on in this presentation. So coastal protection includes levees and storm surge barriers. And in the case of storm surge barriers, these are essentially levees across bodies of water with one or more navigational openings. As a caveat, this presentation is by no means an endorsement of protection measures as coastal flood risk reduction strategies. However, I feel like they should be part of the discussion when considering reducing coastal flood risk for a metropolitan area on the coastline. There are all sorts of negative aspects associated with protection measures. For example, they can provide a false sense of security because protection measures can be overtopped or they can fail entirely. They're also associated with environmental harms. They're typically very expensive and require long construction times. That said, there's lots of evidence to show that when designed and maintained properly, coastal protection, such as levees and storm surge barriers, can provide protection for large regions of major coastal cities up to a given protection level. And this finding shown here was from a review of coastal flood risk reduction strategies that was done by the National Research Council following Hurricane Sandy. The National Research Council brought together over a dozen experts in coastal risk management and produced a report. And they found, as shown here, that hard structures like levees and storm surge barriers are likely to be increasingly important to reduce coastal risk in densely populated areas, particularly because densely populated areas simply lack the space for nature-based alternatives like wetland restoration, and coastal retreat and land use regulations often are in conflict with local development goals and incentives. And over the years, existing coastal protection measures like the storm surge barrier in Stamford, Connecticut, have proven to be quite useful at reducing storm damages, as was the case in Stamford during Hurricane Sandy. The quote here that was given appeared in the New York Times after the storm. And as you see in the lower right-hand corner, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was responsible for the design and implementation of this particular project. And the Army Corps is quite active in building coastal flood protection. A brief overview of the organization is given here. The Army Corps is mostly a military construction organization, but does have a small civil works program. And it is the principal federal agency for flood protection development in the United States. However, it's important to note the Army Corps cannot simply unilaterally build whatever it wants, wherever it wants. It must go through a series of established decision-making criteria. The Army Corps also is an issuer of environmental permits as well as navigational permits. And so they are a big player in the role of building coastal flood protection, and because of which they are immensely exposed to the political aspects of coastal flood risk reduction. And in the U.S., there's currently over $70 billion in projects that have been proposed across the country, many of which are seen here. This is an incomplete list, and the details are not important. But the point is to show that many locations around the country are seriously considering large coastal flood protection projects like storm surge barriers and levees as tactics for managing coastal flooding and sea level rise. All of the reports that are associated with each of these projects have shown that the projects are both technically feasible and economically justifiable, meaning that their benefit cost ratio is greater or equal to 1. Here are some examples of some of these projects that were on the list I just showed. This is a project for Miami, Florida, in Dade County. You can see a proposed levee in the storm surge barrier. Additionally, there was a project being considered for New York City that had several proposals, one of which is shown here, which is a storm surge barrier and levee system placed between Staten Island and Brooklyn. This particular project was defunded in February of last year, and it remains to be seen if it will be funded again and continued. And within New York City, there's been continual issues with having flood projects move beyond the drawing board over the years. You can see that this is not a recent problem. There have been many past failures, beginning with a proposed storm surge barrier for Jamaica Bay in the mid-1960s. There was an attempt to build a levee system around Coney Island in the early 70s that failed. And more recently, there were a couple more failures to build large projects in the New York City, New Jersey harbor area. But while projects have struggled to move forward in New York City, they've gotten built elsewhere. Looking in the past, this is the Galveston seawall that was constructed following the Galveston hurricane in 1900. And in the mid-20th century, New England was home to several projects that advanced from the drawing board and got built. 2 of them are shown here: the Fox Point Hurricane Barrier in Providence, Rhode Island, and the New Bedford Hurricane Barrier in Massachusetts. Additionally, in New England, there was the Stamford project that was completed in the late 60s. And then more recently, the Lake Borgne storm surge barrier levee system outside of New Orleans that was constructed following Hurricane Katrina. So I've shown some background so far, and now I'll get into sort of the portion of my presentation where I'll show some original research on this topic of the political complexity of coastal flood risk reduction projects. And again, I'll focus on these large mega projects that I've shown. And the big question we tried to answer was, why do some of these coastal flood defense projects get built, and why do some of them not? What are sort of the factors that are involved? As I mentioned, in many cases, the reports accompanying these projects suggest that the projects are technically feasible and also economically justifiable, meaning that the benefits of the projects exceed the costs over the lifetime of the project. So why do some projects get built and why not others? And to help answer this question, myself and colleagues reviewed hundreds of papers and books and related subjects, that being natural hazard risk reduction, infrastructure politics, political science implementation research, as well as the climate adaptation literature. And in addition to reviewing all this literature, we also did some original archive work looking at 2 Army Corps projects that were planned for Rhode Island that emerged in the late 1950s and early 1960s. In particular, one of the projects was the Fox Point Hurricane Barrier, which was constructed and completed in the mid-1960s, which still sits across the Providence River in Providence, Rhode Island. And at the same time, the Fox Point Hurricane Barrier was proposed. A similar project was proposed for Lower Narragansett Bay, Rhode Island, which this particular project was a bit different in that it proposed sort of rock barriers with navigational openings that remained opened at all times to allow ships to go through. This particular project was never built and has been shelved for potential consideration in the future. And in terms of answering the question of when do some projects get built and when do some projects not get built, colleagues and I found several factors that emerged related to politics. But these are just some of the four, perhaps most frequent factors that came into play, which we like to call the mess factors. So the first of which is that you essentially need multiple disasters before people begin to consider flood protection strategies. The reason being is that governments are simply just very, very busy. They must pay attention to a number of policy issues at any one time. And floods provide an opportunity for them to refocus their attention on flooding issues. And these are issues that usually don't get attention unless an event actually happens. And so having a single disaster or a number of natural disasters are often necessary to create what's sometimes referred to as a window of opportunity for policy change. And a disaster such as a flood can highlight an existing problem and bring both money and political attention to addressing the problem. If there's no plan or support given to addressing a problem, change is unlikely to occur. And so in the Rhode Island case, there was approximately 3 storms that occurred over about a 16-year period that raised the issue of flooding in downtown Providence and the surrounding area. The first storm that occurred was the Great New England Hurricane of 1938, which was the first major hurricane in over 120 years to hit the state of Rhode Island. Some of the damage can be seen in these pictures, courtesy of the Providence Journal. And this is the first storm of 3 to occur over a 16-year period. The second storm was the Great Atlantic Hurricane of 1944. That was not nearly as powerful, but still caused great disruptions to normal life. It did not receive as much attention in the press, in part due to the activity of World War II. And the final blow that led to permanent action in Providence was the storm Hurricane Carol, which is one of the first storms to actually have a name. Hurricane Carol caused over $100 million in damage in 1954 dollars. It works out to be roughly about $24 billion if you normalize the damages to today's money. The storm also killed about 19 people in Rhode Island and erased about 7.5% of the state's GDP at the time. The most severe damage occurred from flooding, again, in downtown and throughout Narragansett Bay. Many of the images that were shown in the newspapers were very reminiscent of the 1938 storm. And indeed, I think this slide highlights very well the sort of repeat nature of the flooding problem in Providence. That being the same building, this being the Providence Biltmore Hotel, which is now the Graduate Providence Hotel, experienced flooding, same amount of flooding, about 16 years apart. So ultimately, citizens of Rhode Island began to get sick of having to continually clean up after major flood events, and they decided to write several letters to their elected officials demanding permanent action. I also mentioned that at this time that there was no federal flood insurance program, and disaster aid from the federal government was much smaller as a fraction of the total damage than it is today currently. In response to these letters, the governor of Rhode Island at the time, Governor Roberts, wrote to President Eisenhower to ask for assistance with providing a possible permanent flood protection solution following Hurricane Carol. Governor Roberts wrote in his letter it's quoting here, "The enormity of the loss suffered by our people justifies a substantial investment in permanent protection." And roughly about 12 years later, the Fox Point Hurricane Barrier was constructed across the Providence River, thus providing protection for the city against a rare event like Hurricane Carol. The next factor that we highlighted in our analysis was that coastal flood protection structures like levees and storm surge barriers are often in direct conflict with environmental protection goals. The reason being that these structures can often impede natural tidal flows. They can lead to habitat destruction. They can change sedimentation rates, trap pollutants, and just generally degrade water quality in many cases. And unlike the Fox Point Hurricane Barrier that got constructed, the Narragansett Bay barriers in lower Narragansett Bay raised significant environmental concerns with the public. One of the reasons for this was that the Fox Point Barrier was built across the Providence River, which was a heavily polluted area of water, as shown here on the from the report on the pollution of the waters of the state of Rhode Island from 1946. It was attained the grossly polluted categorization, whereas lower Narragansett Bay was given the highest cleanliness categorization. So in response to the potential threat to these pristine conditions in lower Narragansett Bay, elected officials received hundreds of letters from Rhode Island residents in strong opposition to the proposed project. Ultimately, this opposition contributed to the failure of the Narragansett Bay project. The state leadership of Rhode Island did not foresee the public supporting a municipal bond measure that would be needed to cover the high costs of the project, which were significantly larger than the Fox Point Hurricane Barrier. So this particular project that I just mentioned was sort of predated modern day environmental laws that emerged around 1970 or so. And these new environmental protection laws greatly add complexity to the process of implementing a proposed strategy. So many coastal environments are protected by these modern environmental laws, and citizens and nonprofits and other organized groups can use these particular laws to achieve really significant litigation powers. And ultimately, legal judgments are now possible in project decisions that were not the case predating these laws, where you just had sort of a political decision to not move forward with the project based on public opposition. So the third factor we looked at is that achieving stakeholder consensus and building a particular project is often quite hard. So the idea of building a coastal flood protection project itself is not very controversial. However, what exactly to build and where usually causes some vigorous debate. One example of this is the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, which is a $1.5 billion flood risk reduction project designed to protect neighborhoods on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And so long gone are the days when powerful city planners like Robert Moses seemingly unilaterally decided what gets built and where. Modern approaches to planning seek to create an open forum that's transparent, where government agencies, elected officials, and the public can all deliberate over the best course of action. And in the case of the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, This open, transparent forum was able to produce a design for a project that appeased sort of the mass of participants, but ran into trouble when the city received this project. Ultimately, the city officials in New York City rejected the proposal that was produced from the open planning process, and the city pushed forward with a different plan that would result in burying the east side, or the East River Park, rather, under several feet of dirt that would have led to the removal of several hundred large trees that were beloved by many of the neighborhood residents. You can see here neighborhood groups opposing the city's proposal, and ultimately the neighborhood groups filed a lawsuit in an effort to delay moving the city's plan forward. So the last factor I'd like to point out that plays a role in coastal protection projects is that elected officials play an extremely important role in moving projects forward. The reason being is that a lot of these projects require federal involvement, including acts of Congress, and it's just very, very difficult to move big projects through Congress. And this cartoon here sort of pokes fun at this fact. This cartoon is from the late 1950s, and I think still holds true today, over 60 years later. And this is sort of an overview of the process to bring in Army Corps projects to the point where it can begin to break ground. The details of this aren't very important, but the point is to show how complex the process is to move Army Corps, large Army Corps projects from initial interest to breaking ground. So ultimately, leadership is needed to shepherd projects through this long, complex process that requires multiple acts of Congress for both authorization and appropriation. And in the case of the Rhode Island project, strong and continued support from both the congressional delegation and state and local leadership was absolutely essential to move projects from the drawing board to breaking ground and receiving funding. And the story was very different for the Narragansett Bay barriers. The representatives, the congressional representatives for Rhode Island, were very reluctant to support the project given the hundreds of letters they received from the public opposing the project itself, most notably on the environmental protection grounds. So that was an overview of 4 factors that can add political complexity to coastal protection projects. There are several other factors as well that we highlight in a review paper and also a forthcoming article on the Rhode Island barrier projects. However, despite the political complexity associated with projects, large projects are still moving forward today. This is the South Shore of Staten Island Coastal Risk Management Project that is already underway, but it has experienced some delays, and significant work is expected to begin later this year. And additionally, in New York City, the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project is expected to begin at some point this year. And if you'd like to learn more, I suggest you visit my website or send me an email. On my website, I have our review paper that's open access. You're free to check that out to read more about the politics involved in building a large coastal flood risk reduction project. You're also able to view my dissertation on my website and also view the work on the Rhode Island storm surge barriers as well.
DJ, thanks for the great presentation and all the historical photos out there. I put in the chat that a number of us are actually quasi-hoarders. and have all these old reports and gems, but they really do have value. One of the questions or themes that I saw show up in a couple of the questions out there is related to when you put a project in one place, what happens somewhere else. But I'm going to read a specific question, not from a technical sense, but from this political mess sense, which is our homework from you to learn what mess is and practice it. And that is, in your opinion, will building coastal levees, seawalls, and other defense systems give people a false sense of security about future flood risk, perhaps encouraging more development and less awareness to what's out there?
Absolutely. I think this dates back to Gilbert White's work, in the early or mid 20th century, rather. And you do see this happen when this levee effect, when you have, protection is only protection up to a certain level, and these things can be overtopped. And once people move in, they kind of forget about the threat. They usually will, sometimes they don't have to pay for flood insurance anymore if the levees are FEMA approved. This occurred in New Orleans recently, being exempted from paying flood insurance in some areas. So I think it's people's memories are short. There's an event or multiple series of events, something gets built, and then people forget about the problem. And of course, as sea levels rise slowly over time, the protection level of these structures will just erode, and there needs to be attention going to these structures to upgrade and adapt over time as the hazards changing.
Great. Thanks, DJ. I apologize that we didn't have more time for questions here, but we do need to move on to Lauren's presentation. DJ might not be able to stay with us for our combined questions after Lauren finishes with questions for her presentation. So DJ, if you can, that's great. But if not, I know you have another meeting out here on the West Coast. It's still early afternoon, so it's going to be a while. Otherwise, if we were face to face, we'd kidnap him and take him to the bar, and we'd treat him to a beer and pick his brain on these old reports. So I owe you next year, which I believe is in Orlando, which should be pretty dang fun. So with that, thanks, DJ. I'm going to introduce our next and final speaker for this session is Dr. Lauren Knapp. Lauren has experience with over 210 citations of peer-reviewed publications, so a very prolific researcher writer. By training, she is an environmental economist, so she's the one who's going to make this all close for us, specializing in the cost-benefit analysis of ecosystem services and their valuation, which has always been like the golden egg for us to crack out there for public benefits, where you get federal and state dollars. Is what is the ecosystem monetization? And it's not just the money you spend is what you get back. There's a multiplier. But she'll also be talking from her experience with NOAA's Office of Coastal Management on valuing marine economies, and most importantly, training local communities on how to use the economics to inform wise decision-making. So with that, we're going to watch Lauren's video, and then we'll have time for some questions for Lauren. And please make active use of the chat. Lauren, you're up on the video now.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending this session today. My name is Dr. Lauren Knapp. Sorry we can't be together in person, and I hope to see y'all in person next time at the next ASFPM conference. I'm an environmental economist by training, and I'm on contract to NOAA's Office for Coastal Management at our headquarters in Silver Spring. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about property values, taxes, and infrastructure, really getting a sense for what's at stake when we're thinking about coastal infrastructure that's at risk. So this is our team. I'm a part of the socioeconomics group within our Office for Coastal Management that is spearheaded by Kate Quigley there on the left. I also work alongside two other fabulous colleagues, Gabe Sadiloff, our data guru, and he keeps us in line, and Ravi Chatila, our associate coastal economist. Together, we work to infuse economics data, develop trainings, conduct analyses, and just conduct related efforts across all coastal issues within OCM. As a part of my role, I help on really myriad economics projects across the entire portfolio, just cross-cutting and nationwide. So this includes things from valuing a subset of the U.S. marine economy, as I work on 2 marine economy accounts, to serving as subject matter experts for reviews on technical reports, to project management type efforts on a new project, for example, that we have started to comprehensively value the ecosystem goods and services provided by U.S. coral reefs. So just quickly, our outline today, first I want to talk about managing what you can count and why that is important. I'll give you an overview of Esri Business Analyst and why we're using it and what it is. I will highlight 2 case studies we've just started with these data, and I'll detail next steps and where we're going with it. So you can only manage what you can count, right? I would argue, at least. To understand and inform coastal investment decisions under limited budgets and in the face of increasing frequency and magnitude of coastal hazards, officials have become appreciative of having a full understanding of the breadth and magnitude of infrastructure in areas that are at risk. So, right, how do we measure that? How do we, ensure that? How do we count that? How do we incorporate that into planning? And ultimately, sound decisions from an economic perspective. So this presentation will examine a series of case studies that use Esri Business Analyst data to look at various indicators of value. And that includes property taxes, property values, and extent of infrastructure. First, the management context, right? In coastal management, communities are often faced with decisions, as we just mentioned. Questions arise in these, such as for adaptation planning, for example. In this process, there are inputs or metrics that a decision maker might want to know to help inform prudent long-term planning. So some questions a decision maker, you could imagine that they might make, such as a project manager or other stakeholders might be faced with it, to include how much infrastructure is at risk. What are the value of, number of, and location of these properties that are at risk? If these structures are lost, what are the ancillary impacts? For example, what's the lost tax revenue we can expect to local services? It's not just that the structure itself is lost, but lost revenue for programs locally that we all care about. So we can present economic data spatially to help us provide answers, right? It can help offer metrics to inform planning, and then that can be supplemented with other socioeconomic and demographic layers to provide this context for these local decisions. In particular, it really help, especially in terms of prioritization, right? When we're thinking about these important decisions, such as, for efforts at like development, mitigation, adaptation, or even managed retreat. So I'd like to now just quickly go over Esri Business Analyst and this tool that offered through Esri and what it is for those who aren't aware of the product. So Esri Business Analyst is a product offered at cost within ArcGIS. It offers myriad business and infrastructure data. A lot of it is available through the Census American Community Survey, ACS. It allows a researcher essentially to spatially map, and you can QA/QC as well, businesses through using the North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS codes. In particular, one benefit is that it achieves a really high level of fidelity and granularity by providing point level business data. So we're not talking about aggregated up, but you can actually plot the individual businesses on a map. And one particular benefit is it allows one to capture a snapshot of value of say businesses that are at risk. So now I'm just going to quickly highlight 2 case studies that we have started to compile with this, still pretty early stages. But one is from New Hampshire and one is from the outer coast of Washington. So this was our first case study we completed using Esri Business Analyst data a couple months ago for, as you can see, coastal New Hampshire. right? And as I mentioned, we have data on housing value, we have median housing value, we have weighted property tax. These are at the block level. Some data comes in from ACS and some comes from private companies, and Esri does some modeling for some fields that they have as well. And, as you can quickly see, just a quick glance, this shows for coastal New Hampshire the total number of housing units at risk by block group, right? As you can see, it ranges anywhere from 600 housing units up to 1,300 or so right there on the coast. So this is really just a first step you could start to imagine of looking at one metric, that is total number of housing units that are at risk, the first step in doing that. Likewise, and switching to the opposite coast, we are working on finishing up another case study alongside the economists at Washington Sea Grant. This is, we focused in on, after having some conversations with him, we decided to focus in on the town of Ocean Shores, Washington. For those of you that aren't familiar, it's in the North Pacific next to the North Bay. And on the left, you have their total number of housing units potentially at risk from future sea level rise. So we're plotting there the same layer that we did on the previous slide. And on the right, we started to pull in average value of occupied housing units with mortgages that are potentially at risk from future sea level rise. So as you can see, definitely the areas, really the quick key takeaway here for someone especially not familiar with these maps, a decision maker that doesn't use GIS a lot or economic data a lot, a quick takeaway here is, a higher number of housing units and on average, higher number of average value of the mortgage for those occupied housing units on the coastline. But again, this is just aggregated up to the block level. So we are excited. And a next step to this is we are layering these data now with tsunami flood risk layers and various sea level rise projection layers. So as you can tell, this is still pretty preliminary. First and foremost, we need some more data. As I mentioned, those additional hazard layers to be able to then intersect. And we're excited about where this is going to go. I just want to quickly highlight some other next steps that we are planning on taking with this effort. So as I mentioned, right now, we're just plotting this as a baseline, right? So, this is just the simple layers of number of housing units, extent of tax revenue, or what's the value of those housing units, of that housing stock. So what that essentially gives us and comes up with is just showing geographically a baseline, if you will. Or another way to think about it is an upper bound of what could be at stake or what could be lost, the total value or the total number, if it was all wiped out. And as we know, that's likely not going to be the case, right? If a hurricane comes or a tsunami strikes or there's storm surge, it's likely not going to take out every structure there. So we really have to pare this back in a realistic fashion. And as you could tell in the previous case studies, we're not yet accounting for sea level rise expectations or projections, rather, digital elevation models, storm flooding likelihood, and so on. So we're excited and looking forward to layering these data and different tools that we have through NOAA's Digital Coast. There are two in particular, the Coastal Flood Exposure Mapper and the Hurricane Tracker, as well as combining it with other data sets. And additionally, something I'm really excited about too is acquiring additional data with Zillow to layer in here. So I think we're all pretty familiar with Zillow. If we've ever bought a house, the housing market is booming right now. I just bought a condo a couple months ago. Very fascinating to watch what's going on in that market. But something you might not know is that they offer a free database online to partners called the Zillow's Assessor and Real Estate Database. So this database is marketed as the country's largest real estate database available to academic, nonprofit, and government researchers. And it provides data on over 400 million public records across the U.S. And across counties. And we're talking a lot of data here. And the database includes property characteristics, geographic information, valuations for 150 million plus parcels. And the really nice thing in particular about this is that it includes both commercial and residential properties. as well, including more than 20 years of deed transfers, mortgages, foreclosures, auctions, property tax delinquencies, and so on. It's just really nice that you have both the commercial and residential. So hopefully we're working on it now, and these agreements can be tricky, but we are hopefully setting up an agreement with them to get this data set. And some of the folks in our team have been communicating, and we've heard from Zillow actually that they are excited to see what we come up with. Now, just to put this in context for a quick second, and putting on my environmental economist hat, for those who don't have the economic chops, one great thing about these real estate transaction data is that allows for us to potentially tease out values for nearby environmental co-benefits based on housing transaction sales through a method what we call hedonic pricing. So for example, just recently the city of Miami contracted with ICF International to do a study on exactly this, right? Looking at, whether homes are more valuable based on their level of lack of exposure or lack of risk to flooding. Maybe they're more valuable if they're near elevated roads. They're doing a lot of upgrades to their system, and I know stormwater systems there. So this is certainly something this sort of data set would allow one to conduct that type of analysis. I also want to mention there are other providers of these data. I mean, of course, Zillow isn't the only one. We are working with the Census Bureau on a related separate project, and they have their housing data. They get, they've worked with CoreLogic. They've gotten that data from 2006 to 2017, and from Black Knight starting in 2019. And both of these providers are similar to Zillow in that they collate publicly available information from county tax assessments, MLS, etc. So just wanted to flag that if you're interested. Okay, some results and products we see coming out of this effort. We see myriad possibilities for how we expect the ZTrax database, as well as through the Esri Business Analyst product, how these can be leveraged within our existing Office for Coastal Management tools and by our partners. And really, it spans a gamut from residential and commercial, looking at the marine economy, as well as private homeowners, and just as well coastal and riverine system perspectives. You really see a lot of flexibility and multi-purpose here. So in specifically, some examples of the ZTrax data could be used by NOAA and our partners. Research results can be summarized and presented in white papers, reports, or on digital coast tools like our Quick Report tool. Other potential applications we see could be applied to existing NOAA or Office for Coastal Management tools, like I mentioned earlier, including our sea level rise viewer, lake level viewer, and flood exposure mapper. After plotting point level data, we can show how firms and housing structures are at flood risk, their level of flood risk using tools as the sea level rise viewer, as I mentioned. And then, we see at the end that this can really augment town planners' decisions on critical infrastructure that may be at risk from coastal hazards, and inform, whether community can shift to lower flood risk areas, inform those conversations. So I just want to quickly wrap up here. That was a very broad brush overview, but I do want to just make a final plug and mention that our socioeconomics team offers generally for coastal management, economics, socioeconomics issues. We offer what we call project research consultation. Some folks in our office and within NOAA refer to this as technical assistance. But essentially, just examples of this include anywhere from brainstorming project ideas, helping you identify useful questions to ask, say if you're hiring an economic consultant. For example, in economics especially, I know this intimately, that many terms and phrases can mean similar things or perhaps sometimes confounding things. And it's so important to be specific, especially in the research question that you're asking from the beginning, but also at the end to even identifying results. So we could help you brainstorm those questions to ask to make sure you're getting out of your analysis what you want. And related to that, common pitfalls and tips to consider. We hear from our partners sometimes that people think they want a certain type of analysis, economic impact, and they go down a road of a benefit cost analysis, and it's not going to get you those methods that you're looking for. So just being aware of those pitfalls and other general tips can be helpful. Finding and using data. This is something I see all the time, especially, we are developing some economics valuation trainings. And this is in particular when you're thinking about using values from other areas, an approach we call benefit transfer. It's important to know where other literature are, where other data are. We could point you to the data we have, data our partners have. So we could potentially be a resource and a conduit for that. And then also just, flagging that, we could potentially not do an analysis for you, but we have provided some expert review on draft benefit cost analyses for some of our partners that are applying to DOT MERAD or FEMA BRIC applications. I just did 2 of these last month. And of course, like I said, we can't do the analysis for you, but sometimes nudges, right, make a big difference. And related to this, we are developing more broadly just general trainings to help on economics guidance for coastal management professionals generally. So I would be happy to chat with you about that if you're interested as well. So please call or email me. We'd be happy to chat. And with that, I'd love to take any questions, comments, or reflections that you may have. Thank you so much.
Welcome back, everybody. We're going to do some special questions first for Lauren, and then if we have time, we'll bring Renee back as well, and then Lauren and Renee both can entertain other questions you have. DJ unfortunately had another meeting at 3 o'clock California time, so he had to wander off for that. So there were several questions that came in. Lauren, one of the ones that I'm going to bring up is actually one of Renee's questions, but I think it was echoed by some others in the chat too. And specifically the question is wondering about social vulnerability. Areas that have high density and lower property values. Also the role of housing stock, flood risk, and availability of affordable housing. How does all that get accounted for when we're looking at valuation metrics to basically describe why we should be investing in protecting ourselves from flood risk?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for the question, Renee, and others sort of woven into that. As I mentioned in the talk, right, this is really sort of just the first cut, the baseline, the preliminary look at the analysis. And certainly just looking at something such as housing value and sort of what's the value of these structures, looking at potential tax revenue that's coming to the local community, looking at the number of structures or businesses. I didn't show any of the maps of looking at the point level data of the businesses. This was just, I was giving a sense of the thematic maps for the ACS data on the property value metrics, right? But even the case goes with that as well. It's just really the first step. So certainly combining, and that's where we're really hoping to go down that road, and looking at just what are the demographics in these areas. And how does that mesh up, and where are they located in terms of the businesses themselves, and also in relation to the hazard areas. One thing in particular, I mentioned this project that we're sort of separate but related. We're kicking off with the Census Bureau and the North American, the NAICS codes. That's just that system, for those of you who aren't aware, it's just a tax accounting system. Businesses have to for tax reporting purposes, establishments have to, report on a 2 to 6 hierarchical classification system on what sector and industry, and down to a really high level fidelity of where they fall into the economy. And that's just the accounting system that they fall under. So we have that information, and some of it is protected. There's only so much you can share. But I mentioned that because we are working on trying to get higher fidelity information on businesses, and for example, who owns the businesses, right? It's not just the type of business or what what their what the GDP is or number of employees that's only just a first layer. And so we are excited about, trying to see what are the demographics of the folks that own those businesses, and how does that also play into a role? So that's a specific example of getting at this question that we're excited to go down that road in the near future.
Great, Lauren, and I want to moderator prerogative here, do a little bit of a follow-up on that same database. And it was reassuring to hear that it's actually the tax data, because I'm just going to do a little anecdotal thing for the audience. Is in California, we send out an annual flood risk notification flyer in the Central Valley, the middle part of California, where we have great flood risk, to let them know, hey, your property is protected by a levee and you're at risk by flood insurance. And we get angry calls like, oh my God, how do you know where I live? I'm like, we are the government. We're very interested in your property because there are some taxes associated with it. I don't really say that, but sometimes people forget the government does need to know where revenue generation streams are so we can protect those assets. But when we get into large scale valuation techniques and saying, hey, this is an area that's vulnerable at risk, and here's really the benefit cost of going through and protecting this area. When we get into these business layers, a lot of business we saw in 2020 come and go. How timely and accurate is this data kept alive?
No, absolutely. I think we've learned a lot from this enormous, and that's even an understatement, shock to the global, national, regional, local economies through COVID and the repercussions for that. And certainly we're not seeing those data yet in terms of how it's affecting local marine economies, but we are certainly anticipating it. We have been reading about it in the New York Times and how it's affecting self-employed fisheries workers and myriad businesses in various sectors and industries in the national and working waterfronts in these coastal communities. In terms of the NAICS codes, right, that's, the federal tax accounting system and used for other purposes as well. And, that's actually on the businesses to self-report. So I will say, and this is separate than COVID, but there needs to be a certain level of QA/QC that needs to be done. Oftentimes businesses don't know how to report themselves, so they could end up in a slightly different NAICS code depending on what level you're looking at. So definitely that's something that we've set up a procedure on how to do that and make sure they end up in the right cut in our analysis at the end. But in terms of Esri business analysts and using the data that they pull in with that and sort of their own sort of collated metrics through Esri business analysts and that service, they do some of their own internal tweaking, and I really, I wouldn't be able to speak to the full validity of that, but I do think they have pretty up-to-date data that gets updated on an annual basis as well. But just a general reminder, I'll just add to close out this response is that, when we're also looking at just marine economies, those data sets are often lagged. It could be anywhere from 2 to 3 years, and that's just the nature of these accounting. So, we work on putting out a report on sort of what's the magnitude and the breadth of the U.S. marine economy as the share of the larger U.S. economy. And so our data for that we use is actually it's a 3-year lag. We're trying to see if we can nudge that a little bit, but so we're not even really seeing COVID impacts yet, but soon.
Great, thanks, Lauren. At this point, we're going to bring Renee back in here too, so we can maybe have a question for either Renee or Lauren on both presentations. We just got a few minutes left. So as Renee's getting queued back up into the thing here, I just wanted to do a little quick recap of what you've seen here today. Is Renee did an excellent job really kind of giving us the basics of sea level rise, talking about why it's important, but more important, why there's uncertainty, which might scare some people, but actually what I liked about it is it really was a statement to addressing this different strokes for different folks sort of belief that I'm a big champion of, as opposed to the one size fits all approach that we've traditionally done when we've gone and talked about risk management. Here, we can right size an action towards how we categorize the risk. Then we moved from Renee's presentation on the uncertainty to DJ's presentation, talking about the importance that stakeholders and that these leaders take in supporting a project to overcome the mess factor, which is you have to get hit multiple times, you have to address these unintended consequences and the environmental considerations, gather stakeholder support and leadership support to move forward. And really the key to that is using the tools and resources that Lauren's talking about, which is go through and show the value of what your project is, and really a map in a GIS, put it out there and then message it and put it forward. So with that, I'm not really seeing any other questions out here, but I'm going to go ahead and ask one in the last minute. Renee, Lauren, you both can jump in. I'll give the other the closing on this. Is in floodplain management, DJ already mentioned Gilbert White and the importance about risk intensification. It showed up in the chat a couple of times. It's something that's near and dear to my heart. We're a state that's actually now losing population relative to the rest of the country, first time in the history of California. But we're still living in floodplains. We're still developing in floodplains. And really, I want to know from your perspective in the coastal floodplains, what do you really see as sort of the future going into like the next latter half of this century when we get into protecting ourselves from these floodplains, or the hazards in the floodplains? I'll give you a 10-foot pole and you can touch the question with the
like
pole.
how Lauren and I both were like, oh, is she gonna unmute?
You want to take a stab at it, Renee, and I'll add in?
Yeah, that sounds good. I think the next 50 years of the century, it's too hard to answer, but I think over the next 30 to 50 years, this topic around intensifying risks and seeing more impacts is definitely becoming more salient, I think, among all the different communities involved in making decisions, not just floodplain management, but the individual people who have to live and work and build and or not in the floodplains. I think we're going to start to see hard lessons learned, some things that will be really successful, and hopefully as a community we'll learn and grow together quickly. I also think there's a great example in terms of how things can be driven from multiple levels. If you look to, say, Florida, at the local level, at a regional compact level, at a state level, they're taking action from the top and the bottom. And I think that really is key. And I think that the states that we'll see that are being successful are doing that.
Thanks, Renee. Lauren?
Yeah, excellent meta forward thinking question. I think Renee handled it famously, so I'm not sure what all I can add. But just some quick thoughts are, again, sort of pulling back the time frame just a little bit into sort of the more the near term, the 5-10 year. I feel a bit more comfortable in that space. I think we're going to continue to see, there's really just in the broader climate and investment perspective. I think there's certainly a large and important focus, especially from your BlackRocks and just investment portfolios largely, on how do we measure and value risk. And that's the traditional risk in terms of these structures, but also transitional risk. How do we move systems entirely? And so, you've seen them across the board start to just seriously pledge and sort of, that's the temperature that I'm reading from the room. So from the investment perspective, that is certainly there. From the federal funding perspective, you have these new game changer programs like FEMA's BRIC. And we see our partners really excited and motivated and geared up and applying for those, as well as other MARAD, DOT, port redevelopment projects. And so, but that is also, of course, the need is there, right? There are these businesses that are inherently dependent on the water, whether it be in sectors or industries that are tourism or living resources or other related industries, whether it's, a nascent but developing offshore wind supply chain that's located near the water. And they inherently are close to these hazards, and that's only increasing more so. And they have to sometimes make hard decisions on manage retreat. Do we move or not? And so from my vantage point, and what I'm sort of seeing from having all these conversations with partners on the ground in these communities, to the federal funding agencies, to hearing what the investors are thinking about and sort of why they're serious about this, is we just higher fidelity information is really important from the social vulnerability perspective to understanding what is at stake, to how do we get over those issues and how do we address it and how do we get through this in an economically sound way, but also in a way that is just and equitable. So maybe I'm biased. I'm always going to say we need more data and we need better data. That's my takeaway.
Great, thanks, Lauren. And since DJ couldn't be here, I'll moderator's prerogative, kind of challenge him to come up not just with the mess, but a new acronym for CLEAN on how he's basically going to lean forward into perhaps doing some sort of evaluation, maybe is the E in his CLEAN, for what is some of the benefits to be had, not just from the investments we've made, but maybe into the future investments, but turning them into narratives that we can address that political support. And I think that's, Lauren, what you were talking about, but I think it's part science. Well, I'm gonna close with a quote from Yogi Berra, great catcher, great manager in baseball, who always said for baseball that baseball was 90% mental and the other half was physical. Well, I actually like to say that mitigation is 90% planning and 50% implementation. And the planning is something you've got to always be on the game. And it's not just planning leaning forward, but it's also looking back, which I think was DJ's message. So with that, I want to thank Renee and Lauren for their fantastic presentations. I hope you enjoyed them as much as I did. The Coastal Flood Risk Challenge in the United States of America and the world is here to stay. We're going to constantly be wanting to live in these nice, pristine areas. And at the same time, these areas are fighting back. That's just a matter of change. So we have to, with our due diligence as floodplain managers, really do that risk reward benefit and evaluate, how can we actually protect the public benefits as well as the private assets that are out there for not just the physical assets, but the secondary losses and effects that are out there. With that, we're going to close for today. I'm going to challenge each of you again to return tomorrow, same bat time, same bat channel, which is going to be 9 a.m. Central Time period on your session of choice. And then you can join us where everyone comes together in tomorrow's plenary. Should be super exciting. There should be an exhibitor booth that's still open where you can go and chat to some of the sponsors of ASFPM, as well as some social activities that are planned. I know you might be tired of the virtual social activities, but in about 3 or 4 years from now, you're going to realize that the walk from basically your bar to your home after these social activities is a much more sustainable, realistic premises in the virtual world than it is in the real life world. Otherwise, I'm looking forward to seeing a number of you in Orlando next year. Thanks, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.